am J.C. Barnes. I'm an associate professor in the School of Criminal Justice at the University of Cincinnati. And today, actually, it's my pleasure to be participating in the Oral History Criminology Project. The Oral History Criminology Project is an ongoing effort to preserve the accounts of prominent scholars regarding their role in shaping the evolution of the field of criminology and criminal justice. So we're here in Baltimore, Maryland, attending the annual meeting of the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences in March of 2019. And I am extremely excited to be here with someone who's actually been a great deal to me over the course of my career, my young career. But he's really helped me as being a good colleague recently. Early in my career, he served as a seminal mentor to me in my undergraduate and especially in my master's studies. And then all through that, he's been just a very dear friend. And that person who's with me here today is Dr. J. Mitchell Miller, who's professor at the University of North Florida in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. I've got a few opening statements about Mitch, and then we'll just sort of have a conversation. But Mitch he's made contributions in several areas in criminology and criminal justice over his distinguished career. But I'd say, and maybe we'll get into this, but I'd say he's probably most known for his work in the overlapping areas of drugs and crime, his work in qualitative criminology, and his work in the field in program evaluation. He's a nationally recognized expert on drug enforcement and substance abuse treatment delivered by criminal justice system actors. He's been a leading advocate of applied criminology and an influential figure in the development of evidence-based practices and the whole evidence-based practice movement that they're firmly situated in currently. A few criminologists, I would say, have spent more time in the field than Mitch, so he really puts the evidence-based practices to work, running the full spectrum of both producing the evidence and seeing that it's implemented properly and with fidelity in the field. Mitch has been in the field, I'd say, to kind of come back to that point, that few have spent more time in the field than Mitch. It's rare that you could find a month or even a week where Mitch is not actually visiting a prison, a jail, or some arm of the criminal justice system, and coordinating or corresponding with these folks. He's been heavily involved in discipline governance as well. He's held positions in several of our professional organizations, high-ranking, decision-making positions. But perhaps more so, he's had influence through frequent guest talks that he's given, invited guest talks at both criminal justice system agencies and arms of the system, and distinguished talks at universities around the world, really. He's also delivered pre-conference professional development workshops that apply to his work. He served as a grant reviewer and scoring grants for many major federal agencies. He's done expert witness work, and he served as a DOJ consultant for two assistant attorney generals. So I'd say before we turn it over to Mitch and kind of hear some of his thoughts, I'll provide a brief overview of sort of your background, just sort of go through your CV, both the living CV but also the professional CV, and then I'm sure that'll provide many jumping off points for us. So Mitch, as you may have surmised by now, was raised in Tennessee, in Nashville, Tennessee, hence the tie. He attended Lipscomb Academy and then did undergraduate work at the University of Tennessee before transferring to Middle Tennessee State University, where he received bachelor's and master's degrees. He then went on to receive his PhD in sociology from the Department of Sociology at the University of Tennessee. So go Rocky Top. And then he had a noteworthy graduate career that was highlighted by several accolades and several important recognitions. So he was selected to the American Sociological Association Honors Program, This is all while he was a graduate student. He won the ACJS Outstanding Graduate Student Paper Award. He worked as a graduate research associate for the Society of Study of Social Problems. He joined the faculty of the former College of Criminal Justice at the University of South Carolina while ABD in the fall of 1996, and then he was awarded the PhD that December of 1996. On that note, he was the last faculty member actually tenured at USC, South Carolina's College of Criminal Justice. They've since turned to turned into the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice, but Mitch was tenured under the college in 2001. While at USC, he held joint appointments in the College of Social Work and School of Environmental Studies, and served 2 terms as Director of Graduate Studies in Drugs and Addictions, which was an interdisciplinary program of substance abuse research and treatment certification. Also while at USC, he served as the lead evaluator of the Moscow Police Command College, and he served as and was a visiting professor at the Moscow International University. Excuse me. He moved to become chair of the Department of Criminal Justice at the University of Texas at San Antonio in 2006, where he stayed until moving to his current location in North Florida in 2014. And then just very quickly, a few mentions of some of his accomplishments that we haven't already mentioned and his accolades. Some noteworthy items. Mitch is past president of the Southern Criminal Justice Association, which is one of the regional associations for ACJS. And he was the Southern CJ's Association Outstanding Educator. He was awarded the Outstanding Educator Award in 2016. He served as editor of 3 separate journals in the field. First, the Journal of Crime and Justice, then the Journal of Criminal Justice Education, where I actually served as managing editor for a short stint. He is the current editor of the American Journal of Criminal Justice, and he has served as editorship of 2 major encyclopedia sets that we'll likely get to, some major reference volumes that he oversaw. He's consistently ranked nationally for publication, and especially for his grants productivity, grant acquisitions. And he's one of very few who actually gets consistently recognized in both categories, for both the basic sort of pure scholarship and then the applied side, if you will, for acquiring grants to have these things implemented. And then finally, Mitch is an ACJS Fellow, which is the Academy's most prestigious award. And or the most prestigious recognition, and he's won the Academy's maybe, or at least arguably, most prestigious award with the Fellows of Recognition, which is the Bruce Smith Jr. Award, Bruce Smith Senior Award, excuse me. Last year for his contributions to the discipline in criminal justice and the criminal justice system. So with that extended intro, welcome, Mitch. It's nice to see you. Nice to have a chat with you.
Happy to be here.
Yeah.
Hearing all that sort of makes me feel a little old.
Yeah, it takes a little time to rack up some of those sorts of recognition and honors, especially those sorts of lifetime and career achievement awards. So, and actually, sort of thinking there, that's a good point to jump off with one of the first things I wanted to hear from you. And I'm we've known each other a long time, but there are many questions I have here for you today that I genuinely don't know the answer to some of these things, and this is actually one of them. So it's a good place to start. How did you get into this? How did you get into criminology, the research in criminal justice outcomes and programs?
Well, originally I was planning to go to law school, and I applied and did not get accepted into any law schools that I really wanted to go to. So my original plan was to retake the LSAT and to reapply and to sort of stay sharp and academically involved. I thought I would take a master's course in criminal justice for that in-between year. And I really liked the coursework. I got into it, ended up doing a master's thesis on a drug enforcement theme that really piqued my interest in ironies of social control. And before I knew it, I was in the doctoral program at UT Knoxville and have kind of been on that path ever since.
And so the master's course that you took that sparked it all, that would have been at Middle Tennessee, or was that
It was
in Knoxville?
at MTSU. Under Lance Selva, who was my master's thesis advisor. He was a critical criminologist at a Florida State University, had studied under Corey Richie Mann along the same time with Bob Bone. So I was exposed to, probably for the first time, sort of critical and sort of analytical way of looking at things that was fairly rare for my background, being from Middle Tennessee, raised in the Lipscomb Academy, which is a southern traditional conservative religious environment. So I was just really engaged right away in the subject material, and have remained so since.
So it started with some of the critical aspects of criminology, the critical theories that struck a chord with you, despite maybe the traditional southern conservative background.
Well, it was a contrast for sure.
Yeah. So that's okay. So you mentioned Lance Self, and I know over the years of getting to know you, I know that he was one of a major influence on you. But would you want to expand on that, or talk about other influences that you've had along the way?
Oh, well, there have been so many. Certainly the professors at UT Knoxville, absolutely outstanding. Michael Benson and Neil Shover demonstrated on a daily basis really what was necessary in terms of both work ethic and the quality of scholarship that you had to realize in order to meaningfully engage and participate in the discipline. So in many respects, along with others in my cohort, such as Andy Hotstetler at Iowa State, Heath Coates at Alabama, Birmingham, others, in many respects, I think we've tried to emulate these characteristics in our own career since, and I think we've been fairly well served having done so.
Yeah. It's funny how things sort of have symmetry, right, and come around and come full circle with now Mike Benson being one of my colleagues in Cincinnati, and I couldn't agree more. He would be a great one to model a work ethic after. So moving to kind of a related but a different question. So
well, if I can elaborate more, because
yeah, sure.
Certainly. As the criminologists on the faculty, their influence was probably the most consequential, particularly in regards to getting involved and participating in the discipline. But in terms of my overall, I guess, academic and intellectual development, I was fortunate while at Tennessee to have other experiences that really augmented my career, I think, overall. Additionally, on the faculty, a qualitative sociologist, really environmental sociologist, the late Sam Wallace, who was also on a dissertation committee. I was able to work with him, and he actually coined the phrase Skid Row, which someone told me that the band Skid Row, he gets some sort of royalty.
Really? How
of
interesting.
their activity. But he actually authored a book that I think is somewhat faded into obscurity, titled just that, Skid Row, wherein he went and actually lived amongst the homeless to understand alcoholism and just that, the individuals that populated Skid Row, from a covert participant to observation methodology, which is extremely rare, as we know, in the discipline. So I found that fascinating, and he had a lot of influence on the way that I thought about things, at least methodologically. Also, I would like to mention that while at Tennessee, I was very, very fortunate to have the opportunity to work as the research associate for the Society for the Study of Social Problems. So while probably not that well known in criminology and criminal justice, the environmental sociologist on the faculty at Tennessee, Tom Hood, was the executive director of SSSP and offered me the position. So I'm very thankful to have had that opportunity to serve in that role. Primarily, it was a combination of administrative, graduate assistant tasks, some engagement with the society's social activists, I think what people are referring to primarily as scholar activism today, but SSSP was certainly well engaged in that sort of mindset well before criminal justice adopted it. And so, that was very interesting. But during the summers, it was a 12-month appointment. During the summers, the graduate student was more or less put on loan to the president of SSSP to help plan the upcoming conference. So through this process, I came to work with and get to know quite well the late Bill Chambliss. So a side note of interest, actually Bill Chambliss introduced me to Holly Miller, who is my wife and also an
active
criminologist.
That's amazing. Yeah.
So I mean, it is sort of a small world reality. I went later when I was on the faculty at South Carolina. Bill called me up and he said, I have an outstanding student here who I've just talked out of going to law school, and I'm going to send her to you for a graduate student. So she came on down. She finished her undergraduate work at the University of Maryland and had previously transferred from George Washington, where she did Bill, to Maryland, and then from Maryland on to South Carolina to work for me. And so she worked for me for a couple of years and then went on over to the sociology department to get her doctoral program. And we reunited a few years later, and here we are still together. But I doubt I would have never known Holly if not for Bill.
I've never heard that story. That's great.
But Bill really took me in, and I was really really fortunate to be able to have mentors in SSSP outside the UT faculty that really helped me understand the discipline on sort of a national level, and also just from the perspectives of additional high scholars. The other primary person that I was exposed to and was fortunate to be influenced by in SSSP was Al Cohen. Al Cohen was also a past president of SSSP and was really active, and I had gotten to know Al to some extent through SSSP meetings, and even after being past president, he remained very engaged as like a section leader and was involved in committees and so forth. But you mentioned earlier that I was fortunate to be selected to participate in the ASA honors program. Well, part of that is you present a research paper, and it's a little bit of a debate sort of format where 3 or 4 people present on the same topic, and then you at the end sort of debate contrasting ideas. Well, our topic was, is Al Cohen a strain theorist? Because he's frequently cited as the seminal or founding figure of subculture, or what we refer to as cultural transmission theory today. So I had prepared this argument that there were strain implications, but that no, that was not the case, and was trying to argue this traditional, that he was the pioneering figure of the cultural perspective. And when it came time for the session, which was sort of the format was a roundtable format, so it was somewhat collegial. But when I showed up and was nervous enough to be participating in this,
as a student or as a
it was at the Fontainebleau Hotel in South Beach, Miami.
Yeah.
But when I showed up for the session, sitting at the table was Al Cohen. To listen to all these graduates, listen to these graduate students opine on his career, and it's been too long. But he must have liked what I had to say, because we went out for coffee afterwards, and we became friends. He would call the SSSP office to talk. I was very fortunate that he line edited a couple of my early article submissions, which improved them dramatically. He graciously co-authored one modest piece with Kevin Bryant, who was on in the sociology department at UT at the time, and now on the faculty at Benedictine College in Kansas with us. But he really took me in. I was able to go to additional conferences, whereas a poor starving graduate student I otherwise would not. And Al would let me sleep on the couch in the suite or whatever, and take me to lunch and so forth. So he was a major influence as well. So I certainly want to give credit where it's due there.
Yeah, certainly. And that all came from your connection with the social problems.
Well, Triple SP was
right?
how was the sort of the launching point. Yes.
Wow, that's really fun. I had never heard that story about Holly with how you kind of heard about it before you actually met her. Because I of course met you and Holly at South Carolina.
Well, no, people can say, oh, because she was a former graduate student, but in reality, I hired her sight unseen.
Right, because of a glowing recommendation.
And we didn't really become a couple until like 5 or 6 years later.
Yeah.
So
Wow. Well, is it okay if we switch and talk about your work a little bit? So, I of course know that there are several themes that run through many of the numerous things you've published, and the grants, the encyclopedias you've edited. But yeah, I'd like to hear from you. Like, what do you look back and see when you look at, say, your CV, or you think about it? What are some of the major themes that you've tried to emphasize, or maybe that just sort of landed? You just happened to be in a place at the right time and picked something up, or were these, was there some master plan from the beginning to have these couple of themes that go through? So there's a lot of parts there, but yeah, like what are some of the themes, and how did these come about?
The stars have certainly aligned for success on some topics and some projects more so than others. But I guess my first major work was on asset forfeiture, drug enforcement's double-edged sword, and assessment of asset forfeiture programs, which was published in Justice Quarterly. This was really derived from my master's thesis, the paper that you mentioned that won the ACGS Outstanding Graduate Student Paper Award. And so this was a very rare covert participant observation study of asset forfeiture programs, looking at drug enforcement really in the height of the drug war, sort of from an inside perspective, to the conclusion that a lot of what was going on with asset forfeiture was really discrepant than what its stated objectives were. Asset forfeiture was touted as an important weapon in the war on drugs that could, through civil forfeiture, hold drug dealers accountable by taking the proceeds of their profits civilly, where they were otherwise protected through fall guys or other legal protections, that they could not be criminally charged. And of course, this way of thinking received a lot of public support, because it was also touted as that these resources that were being seized, that were languaged primarily as ill-gotten gains or fruits of the poisonous tree, if you will, would then be reinvested into drug enforcement operations, thereby affecting taxpayer savings. And this provided a lot of support. But what our study found was that in reality, asset forfeiture had become something of a runaway train for law enforcement, wherein the individuals that were being targeted for essentially seizure, well, you would like to think arrest and seizure, but sometimes there were seizures even without
Sometimes
arrest.
just a seizure, yeah.
So we're not necessarily these major influential figures in local drug markets, but we're just lower level drug users or street level dealers, small functionaries, if you will, and they were being targeted because they had little resource or other legal recourse by which to resist the forfeiture. So when you think about this beyond its immediate sort of social justice implication for selective enforcement, which ultimately has classes and racist implications, but beyond that, it has larger, I think, larger implications for the I guess you would say, the legitimacy of the drug war overall, because to the extent that limited drug enforcement resources are being oriented, that is, case selection and prioritization is being determined by potential profitability associated with the case, more so than actual criminal culpability, which we assume more so equates with public safety and public good, then this, taking the resources to reinvest in this indirect way to then get back to that same objective, it kind of really calls into question what things are about. So, that was the first work.
And that was in Justice Quarterly in '94, right? Just to kind of keep our
'94,
timeline, right?
And it's amazing to me the shelf life that the piece has had, not just the number of reprints over the year, but how it has had recurring utility sort of in real-world settings in terms of requests to testify for state Senate subcommittees that are considering state-level forfeiture reform, or in various expert witness cases, primarily defense attorneys that are trying to use the research in support of constitutional principle proportionality argument against their client, or perhaps invoking the innocent owner protection clause. So most of all, though, it's extremely satisfying now that we're having this conversation, in that we've just seen the federal ban on forfeiture just here in the last month. So the fact that the work was cited as evidence in need of the reform, I think shows that it probably did have some meaning in the end.
Yeah. I mean, 25 years on, it's still having these major impacts. Being cited for major reforms. So that one, you would have published that as a graduate student, right? Because
I submitted that, I think, probably my second or third year in the doctoral program at Tennessee.
That's quite impressive.
And went through a lengthy review process. So I was probably ABD by the time it actually came out, which was very fortuitous and probably helped me on the job.
Right.
Timing of that.
Yeah, certainly wouldn't have hurt. Well, then you've quickly followed that up, though, right? With another impactful piece, also published in JQ.
Well, the success off of the asset forfeiture piece and the attention it got, I actually had an interview that was featured in the London Times, so it had a little bit of international impact as well as in the media in the U.S. Really embedded me into wanting to be. I thought at the time that I would have a career focused on trying to evidence and bring to light ironies of social control. And of course, this aligned very well with the critical chronological.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Even the asset forfeitures, you can see traces of that.
So my doctoral dissertation, I think, sort of within the same conceptual arena and the same ideological framework was the same, but the focus instead was on confidential informant utilization. Well, in some respects, this was a close cousin to forfeiture research, because informants are the primary functionaries that actually affect the forfeitures. They set the people up for forfeitures. So I was interested in sort of what I've come to understand as the informant life course. How and why is it that people become informants? What do they do as an informant? And then sort of the assistance, how they get out of it. So it's a very hard topic to research because, as the namesake suggests, confidential informant is a very difficult sample to identify and work with. And it's quite a human subjects challenge with IRB to get approval. So that probably explains the dearth of research both on forfeiture and informants, for that matter. I actually got IRB approval at both institutions to study the topic, but I think a lot of people just shy away from them because it seems like a hard sell. But the informant work, I think, caught a lot of attention to the fact that it's informants rather than undercover agents that actually do a bulk of the undercover work. And I think, although it was not my intent at the time, it was just one element of the discovery of the phenomena that I was researching, but that there was a lot of abuse and misuse of informants. So just like we've seen the forfeiture reform here recently, there's been a lot of attention over the last year and a half regarding confidential informant abuse, particularly of college student informants. And now we're seeing across the nation the introduction in many states of confidential informant Bill of Rights. So essentially a reform movement specific to informants, much like we've seen like forfeiture. So again, it's very satisfying to see that the work is being cited and utilized in that respect. It's probably also somewhat of a testament to the reality of reification of our social processes and practices, that research that can evidence something and that legal and social change to follow is 2 decades later. But I suppose better late than never.
Yeah.
I will say, while I am getting and appreciate getting some credit for contributing to these efforts, at the time it was just pure research, and that others, now with legal reformists and social activists have found value is important. But prior to that, I've been really more, I guess you could say, proud, or it gave me satisfaction that there was utility of the work, and that it was also converted to a JQ article. It's called Becoming an Informant. It's really a motivational typology of confidential informants, and shows that, while the majority of them are legally duressed and somewhat coerced into the role, that there are other motivations such as revenge and mercenary or financial motives, and other things as well. But that article is required reading on the FBI Training Academy, so that sort of gives a sense of satisfaction that it has some real-world pragmatism as well.
I've always thought, actually, on that point, if you didn't say it, I was going to say it for for posterity, but I've always thought that was a better indicator of that work's impact than any other metric. I mean, it wouldn't really matter how many times it's been cited in the scholarly literature. It's being used to train agents of one of the largest and most powerful police agencies in the world, really, and they've been forced to sort of grapple with some of the issues that you raised while still a graduate student, right? But then refined it over the early course of your career.
Well, the informant piece actually did not come out for some time. I intentionally delayed it because it was a little bit of an ethical dilemma, because I was concerned that if I published it too soon after the data was collected, that someone might be able to go back and retroactively through the narratives and the
sort of
citation of the state settings and so forth, be able to connect individuals. And I certainly did not want to bring any harm to anyone, nor did I want to get caught up in any depositions or anything like that. So.
Can
So we waited some time until these were all closed cases
Sure.
to publish.
Sure. Can you tell me a little about, I don't know that I've ever asked you, I've read the paper, of course, but I mean, how did you get started with the first informant? And then how did you build your sample? And what was that process like? Just the actual research process?
Well, in the master's program, everyone had to do a practicum, sort of an internship of sorts. And I was assigned to work on a governor's domestic marijuana eradication task force, where I really didn't do anything other than clerical work, and it was it was really much like an undergraduate sort of internship. But I was able to meet a lot of drug enforcement agents that were then able to connect me with subjects. So then, in sort of a convenience/snowball sample sort of way, I was able to affect the subject pool.
That's amazing. Wow. Well, so to switch gears just a little bit, but in keeping on your research, at least as an pseudo outsider, I'd say maybe another major theme of your work has been in juvenile delinquency. What are some of in your opinion, what are some of the major impacts that you've had in that area? Or what are some of the major works or insights that you've brought?
Well, I never really sought out to be a delinquency researcher per se, but at the time when I was doing the drug research, the real-world connectivity to it was certainly not pronouncing ironies of social control or problems, but rather trying to participate maybe in an evaluation role or some other scientific consultation role to drug enforcement or drug treatment sort of initiatives. And in the height of the drug war, and still, when I was getting started in the mid-'90s, there was a great moral panic concerning gangs. So gangs were seen as primary distributors, because you have to keep in mind this was the crack era. So the work in drug crime quickly sort of spilled over to gangs, and then gangs were sort of derived from juvenile delinquency. And my work in gangs and then entry into delinquency this way really through, you mentioned influences earlier, I should have mentioned, but through a mutual colleague, the late Richard Wright, I came to know Chris Schreck, and we started working together and have had a good run of research on delinquency topics, particularly school safety, works on social sources of victimization more generally. I think that my co-authored work with Chris, Trouble in the Schoolyard, is probably one of my top 5 most cited pieces, as well as the victimization work with Chris and Bonnie Fisher.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you mentioned Richard, and I know you were close with him. And when did he pass?
That would have been, it was right before I got tenured in 2000. He had transferred from the University of Scranton, at the time was chair at Chicago State University.
Okay.
So he was only 48 at the time, and it was really shocking to all of us.
Yeah, because that's right about the time that I believe that I started working with you. Because I remember I never had the chance to meet him, but it was still sort of a fresh wound, if you will, at the time. I remember that. And you two edited at least one volume together, right?
Well, Richard is really how I got into being involved in reference works one in the first place. He originally was to be the editor of Encyclopedia of Criminology by Rutledge, which was a 3-volume set, and he asked me to come in and co-edit it with him because it proved to be a daunting project with over 600 authors and It was 3 volumes. It was quite overwhelming. So I did not plan on taking on this much, but about 2 or 3 months into the project is when he had his heart attack and passed suddenly. So I finished it up the next couple of years alone, sort of as respect to Richard, both as a loyal and helpful colleague, and also we hope that this would be something of a testament to his legacy. He remained the lead author, and that was my first sort of involvement in editing an encyclopedia. Since then, I've edited for Sage the 21st Century Criminology Handbook, whereas unlike the encyclopedia, this was it was a 2-volume set of 100 topics that had essentially 30-page chapter entries each by leading authorities on the respective topics across the discipline. So, being a glutton for punishment, I agreed to do one more, actually several more in a way, because I'm the series editor now for the Wiley-Blackwell International Encyclopedias in Criminology and Criminal Justice, which have a total of 6 titles. I think we're gonna end it at 6. I think the discipline has had enough encyclopedias now. Mine being only a fraction of the whole. But this, I think, has also been an important series that is useful. It's important reference tools, especially for graduate students or for any scholar that wants to have a first look at a literature review when they're getting started on a new topic. So the first title is a 5-volume set on the discipline broadly, if you will, Encyclopedia of Criminology and Criminal Justice by J. Albanese. Chris Schreck did the second title on juvenile delinquency. Kent Curley did a 3rd title on Encyclopedia of Corrections, and Wesley Jennings on the history of crime and punishment. I did one, a smaller, more modest 2-volume set on theoretical criminology, and you actually, along with David Ford, are doing the final one on research methods in criminology and criminal justice. So that's sort of my run of encyclopedias. I don't plan on doing any more. I will say, in regards to reference work, though, since the encyclopedia series, I did edit, along with Heath Copes, the Handbook of Qualitative Criminology.
Right.
And I very much enjoyed that, the opportunity to interact and interface with leading qualitative criminologists both across the country and really interdisciplinary, internationally, to really see how much qualitative criminology has evolved just over the span of my career.
Well, let's follow that thread a little bit. What would you say some of the newer, maybe not innovations, or maybe innovations is an appropriate word, but what are some of those evolutions, or some of those points that stuck out to you while you were editing that?
Well, really, I would say just the diversity.
Yeah.
There are new methods. There are sort of emergent research logics. The work that Heath Copes is doing with it's really the application of visual sociology through photographic evidence and film evidence. Its utility for criminology and criminal justice, which primarily he's pursuing, not unlike my own work, sort of in the realm of drug ethnography.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an important contribution. I think from my mindset, too slow, but nonetheless steady move towards mixed methods, and how we can get beyond this silly debate of quantitative versus qualitative, and which is preferable or superior, and how the two are more complementary and can be utilized better to address really the same questions from different perspectives to give us a more holistic understanding. So I think that was an important theme that evolved as well.
That's actually a perfect segue to the next sort of topic I wanted to hit. Yeah, so I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, I think all the stuff that we've discussed outside of the edited volumes would have, I mean, but those aren't funded so much, but all the projects that we've discussed so far would have largely been unfunded in the traditional sense of getting a grant, right? But you've had a long-standing history of being very successful in grants acquisition, so the traditional funded projects stream, and on that last thing that you just mentioned, you've been quite successful in pursuing and advocating for and helping develop the mixed methods approach and instituting the mixed methods approaches in these funded projects.
Yes. Well, it's not like I was engaged in the peer research and then decided to abandon that to now engage applied. The two sort of overlapped all along, but slowly over time the applied criminology has become more dominant. I think in part some of that is because of the alternative qualitative methodologies that I've employed for the most part in drug subcultures has become increasingly hard to do, because if you're talking about going and collecting data in a naturalistic inquiry orientation, that means being there and participating in the subculture.
Extreme methods, right?
The sad reality of life is we begin to age out of fitting in well naturally into those environments when the majority of the population become increasingly younger from you as time goes on. But I recently was asked to write an account of this, and Michael Motz and Stephen Rice recently had an ethnography reader published by Springer, and I wrote a brief narrative. And so while all this work that we've discussed thus far really has transpired over the span of my career going back to 1995 or so, I first became involved in funded research. Actually, my first semester on the faculty at USC while ABD. I was not planning this. My goal was just to show up and get my dissertation completed before the end of the first year.
Teach your classes and write your dissertation.
That was a focal concern. Fortunately, I was able to wrap it up by that December. But at the same time that I was writing my final dissertation chapter, we were a college of criminal justice, and the dean came in and asked if I would write a section of a grant proposal they were putting in. Really, the state was putting in a proposal to receive multi-million-dollar funding to implement one of the first RSATs, Residential Substance Abuse Treatment Programs, which was housed in Tuberville, South Carolina, in the Tuberville Medium Security prison there. So here I was, ABD, and I was given this task to do, and I wrote it up, and the South Carolina was selected to be one of the states to get the RSAT, and the USC research team received the evaluation subaward. Well, the other faculty members that were on the project were transferred off, and about 3 weeks after receiving my PhD in January, I was named the PI of this large multi-year NIJ grant. So I can remember back all those years ago how the sense of excitement and the sense of importance that I equated with being involved, not just in this role, but this position, that I was now going to do research that would have immediate real-world impact and it would influence something that was happening in the criminal justice world and might influence, individuals' future criminality.
Yeah.
So the sense of significance of doing this research was almost immediate to me, and while I didn't know it at the time, the research design was both outcome analysis of post-release indicators such as relapse and recidivism, but we also went to the prison the research team did on an ongoing basis to do interviews to understand. We didn't really think of it in terms of program fidelity so much in those days as much as we did just, trying to better understand the programming.
What they're doing.
Along the lines of maybe older qualitative objectives of description and exploration, and how these would maybe help contextualize or help us better understand the final outcome. But from the very beginning, the work was mixed methods, even though I didn't really understand the role or the purpose of mixed methods at that time.
So that was probably even some of the early traces of your thinking with the program fidelity. That has been a little bit more recent in your career.
Not so much. The RSAT program led to the evaluation over the next decade or so of various other offender treatment initiatives, primarily substance abuse themed works across the country, really, for different states and local agencies. A couple of national level federally funded projects as well. But I guess the most notable of those is work that we did, which really kind of has largely situated my work that continues on today, primarily in rural settings. So Holly and I evaluated a program in northwest rural Ohio, Auglaize County. And this was essentially a rural reentry program, but it was a reentry program that was attempting to accomplish goals of the reentry movement today, really before the reentry movement had started. So it was sort of a precursor of sorts. We employed a quasi-experimental design and found that it had tremendous success with an 86% recidivism reduction. So BJA named the program and our mixed methods evaluation design as one of 6 national model reentry programs. They printed out a nice glossy pamphlet and mailed that to every sheriff's department in the country. And soon after, we started getting a lot of cold calls for new partnerships, and we've just sort of been going at a frenetic pace ever since. That one article, which was published in Justice Quarterly as well, has really been an impetus to a lot of the work that we've done, and it's also situated a lot of the work in rural settings. So while we've been doing evaluation across the country, one of the primary I think takeaways and I hope lasting value of the work that others will find that we've noted and tried to address moving forward is that there is a tremendous amount of program differentiation that folks often say that they're implementing and delivering a modality, and the assumption is that it is being done according to its theoretical design. But when you actually go and conduct the site visits, you find that that's rarely the case. So when we've begun to think about this, not just in terms of its implications for evaluating the program and the extent that we could really place confidence in observed statistical outcomes, indicators of success, of effectiveness, because we were saying, well, what are we really attributing this success to? A program or some real-world adaptation of it? Or in some cases, the programs, the practitioners were professing to deliver a modality. In reality, we're not delivering it, at all. So in some respects, beyond any more methodological or practitioner sort of benefit through the value of science. Before thinking along those lines, there's a more fundamental, just sort of sheer accountability logic to conducting the site visits. But when you pause and step back and look at the body of evaluation work overall, you find that the vast majority of it is quantitative only. It's only outcome. So we have this knowledge base that we see as sort of, the scientific authoritative reference for program replication, but that's all vested in the assumption, which my experience has suggested is as often as not a false assumption, that the thing that you're recommending is genuine, right? Well, other than going there in person and seeing, I don't know how you can deduce that. I really don't. So we not only did this reaffirm the importance of conducting site visits in evaluation research, but it also made us start thinking more so about implementation intensity and the integrity of services delivery, which today we see primarily as the main purpose of process evaluation, which has to be an assessment of program fidelity. So there's unfortunately a great deal of continued misunderstanding in the discipline concerning the purposes of process evaluation. People understand that process is qualitative and outcome is quantitative, and that mixed methods is, at least arguably preferable to a singular orientation. I'm not sure that most people really believe that because of, I scored heavily for most DOJ sub-agencies, NIDA, SAMHSA, and continue to review more quantitative evaluation designs only, even when applications say priority consideration will be not only for applications that offer optimal spuriousness reduction, presumably through an RCT, or if not, the best alternative through PSM or some other, regression discontinuity or something like that. But also they just say, in black and white, but that also feature fidelity assessment. And yet most applicants just continue to ignore this altogether. And I think that's because people fundamentally don't understand the conceptual basis of what it's about, and that's because we don't teach it, right? And then it naturally follows then that very few people practice mixed methods, because if we don't teach what it is, we certainly don't teach how to practice it. So I could wax philosophic, at great length about this, but briefly, it comes down to, what is our main purpose? What is our main function in conducting program evaluation? To determine, to answer the question, what works, to specify effectiveness. The flip side of that same coin of effectiveness would have to be failure. So when you think about how we would account for failure, we can dichotomize it into theoretical and implementation failure. Well, it's very important to make the distinction. Not only do we not do the process evaluation phase in the first place to even focus on these concerns, I don't think that most people are even aware of it. So if I could speak briefly to it, implementation failure denotes a scenario wherein the intervention, the services delivery intended to affect the modality are so discrepant in the real-world application that they don't reflect the theoretical design of the intervention. Okay? Theoretical failure, on the other hand, is when the implementation and the services delivery had intensity and they were compliant, that is, program fidelity was demonstrated, we just still observed poor outcomes in terms of, no responsiveness and recidivism reduction, or poor relapse or something like that. So obviously it's preferable if we can get to the point of theoretical failure, because that allows you to know that that modality doesn't work, or at least in a particular setting, and you need to go back to the drawing board and consider an alternative approach. But without doing the research, you can't make the distinction, and without the distinction, if implementation failure is the reason that that something didn't work, well, first of all, you're not going to be able to fully know that, because implementation failure masks theoretical failure. So, okay, I don't know how I can rule out implementation failure without doing program fidelity assessment. Right. So, towards that end, we've tried to make these arguments. Holly and I published in Criminology and Public Policy, Rethinking Program Fidelity in Juvenile and Criminal Justice, wherein we introduced instrumentation that is highly customizable across settings and offender programming topics and applications. But what is systematic is that what we provided is sort of a standardized systematic approach across 5 major domains of programming. So this instrumentation should be administered with 2 or more researchers to have inter-rater reliability. It should be utilized in the evaluation of a program on multiple occasions, not just go and visit once, but but ongoing. So where whatever you observe and score, you don't catch them on a particularly atypical good or bad day, right? But so with the concerns that would denote the fidelity overall, we're interested in topics such as, program adherence. Okay, so are the main elements of the modality are they illustrated? Can they be evidenced actually in the real world treatment program? We want to be concerned. We are concerned with dosage and exposure. This is extremely important, and this is why you have to go there, and not just go there, but when you're there, within the mixed methodologies, you have to use multiple qualitative methods. We want to review official materials to make sure that their version of it indeed reflects the original one that they proposed and was funded on, and that is all consistent with the evidence-based design of the intervention in the first place. But we also want to also observe at the site the delivery of services. That's because one of the main domains is participant engagement. Well, with actually observing that, it's hard to really meaningfully score that. I don't want to do it on hearsay, okay? But we also would want to review official documents, because we want to assess staff credentials, but we also want to observe them in practice, where we can score their enthusiasm, the extent to which they can elicit engagement. But reverting back to the dosage exposure, this is extremely important, because I could tell war stories ad nauseum, but I'll share 2 brief anecdotes that evidence the point and why it's important to go there and to look at this domain of exposure. So, in all honesty, probably could throw a baseball from your office to this particular research site, but it was a federal halfway house adjacent to the University of Cincinnati campus, where I was working on a federal grant some years ago, and I had originally interviewed these guys when they were locked up in an Ohio State prison. It was a reentry initiative, and they were now in their transition period in the halfway house, and they were participating in the MRT modality, wherein you work 12 months of modules, and prior to release, they were about halfway through, so it was supposed to be a seamless transition, which is, the selling mantra of the reentry movement program and overall, right? So they were supposed to then, module 7 pick up the first month in the halfway house, and then 8 and so forth. So we want to, in our site visits, interview the primary stakeholders, the treatment recipients, the clients, the offenders, okay, also the treatment providers, but also the administrators of the agencies, who sometimes are involved in treatment and other programming dimensions, and sometimes just supervise the setting where others do it that are either outsourced or insourced, etc. So in the particular Cincinnati story, we first interviewed the director of the halfway house, then we interviewed social workers that were hired as vendors to come and provide the counseling services. And they assured us with great certainty that they had been working the MRT workbooks religiously, and that they were on module 9, and that there was good participant engagement, and that things were as they should be. Then we did 3 focus groups with 4 or 5 where the interviewees were the offenders and the residents of the halfway house that were in the program, that were supposedly receiving these services. And some of them did not even know one another, because it wasn't a cohort per se. It was a rolling admissions logic with how they came to be there. And to a person, they told us, no, the day that we got here, the manager of the halfway house collected our MRT workbooks and put them in a locker, and they've been there since. So that's one example. A less pointed example, but a more general problem that I'll mention too, because I know there are other things you want to cover. That more often than not, we see, and this is a problem not only in terms of shortening exposure and dosage and thus the intensity, and when we really think about it, the taxpayer, because we're presumably getting paid, you're paying for one thing and getting something else, is the replacement of what should be individualized treatment programming services, individual counseling, with focus groups. A counselor can come in and spend 8 hours doing 1 hour each with the offender, and billing $100 an hour, there's $800, or they could do 2 hours with 4 each and get the same amount of money if they're billing per head instead of head per time, which they often do, right? When you think about the fact that, I hope that there was a reason that we implemented and included all of these evidence-based elements, such as actuarial screening to denote the individualized needs of offenders, right, which are highly diverse across people, right? And then when we were talking about substance abuse treatment in correctional settings, which, as we know now, we didn't when I first started, but the reality of co-occurring conditions and dual diagnosis is more often than not. So there are a lot of mental health issues, and with that, there are also with this population has been a lot of exposure to violence, a lot of abuse, a lot of sexual trauma, and it's just unlikely that these folks are going to be able to meaningfully address that through counseling in a group rather than an individualized setting. So again, I don't really know how, with a pure quantitative only evaluation design, you can address these issues. I mean, it sort of sounds like I'm taking it in a social justice or human rights direction, and there may be a touch of that, but it ultimately goes back to does the program have truth in action, right? And I think it's irresponsible that whether it's the social scientist or whether it's the agency professional, to be replicating and financing program replication in other settings on the assumption that they're effective based on some favorable statistical outcomes when you haven't meaningfully even ruled out that that's not a function of program differentiation or one of these other validity threats that derive from our program fidelity domains, or for that matter, even mere coincidence. We don't think about it very often, but programming likes to highlight success and brag about recidivism reduction. But as you know, I think we have an article together early from an evaluation of the juvenile drug court on cherry picking. That there's a certain amount of cherry picking that goes into these program enrollments, and while that's probably a separate debate, it's a reality. And beyond the cherry picking, there's also just the reality of coincidence, or just real life developments, just organic occurrences, where in some of the folks we're going to be successful anyway. So we probably have a somewhat inflated observation of how well we're doing to begin with.
Well, and that highlights the importance of the angle you were taking, the importance of having that qualitative component to inform or even direct the quantitative analysis, and then, we can also use it the other way to use helping make sense of why there might be variation in, say, program outcomes, the same program across different settings. Perhaps fidelity in these different domains are some of those moderator variables, to speak of the quantitative language. That also kind of connects with the next question I wanted to ask you. The question is, I think your work has held up very well to all manner and all range of criticisms that may have been that one could throw at it, or that have been thrown at it. But would you attribute some of that endurance of your work to the mixed methods? The marrying of those two that you really promoted in your work, or there's something else? So I guess the question is, why has your work endured so well and held up so well?
Well, I don't know that we could really meaningfully discuss the shelf life of the mixed methods work, because we published the article with the fidelity scale only.
That's only been
it's only been about 5 years. I think, like we were discussing earlier, 20 years, 25 years is better late than never. But to see that there has been very very latent but nonetheless eventual legal reform that's followed from the excesses and some of the abuses of the forfeiture operations and confidential informant utilization, I think is very rewarding, and to some extent probably offsets or deflects any criticism otherwise. The criticism really hasn't been so much that this has been terrible, cop bashing work, because I think it's kind of common knowledge of anybody. There's certainly there's been a lot of media accounts, a lot of anecdotal evidence that has confirmed our findings, but the controversy has been more with, I think, the ethicality of the alternative methods. The American Sociological Association's Code of Ethics actually bans disguised observation. The British Sociological Association's Code of Ethics does not. So it's a debate that goes on, and I don't think it's one that's going to ever be resolved, certainly by not us here today. It's probably going to go on as long as the qualitative versus quantitative sort of philosophy of science debate itself. But it is, I understand the concerns, because it kind of becomes a claim by which you can say, the social scientist has a license to do anything, void of any concern of any human subjects. Okay, but if you're going to apply that strictly, then you're saying, okay, I'm limiting myself only to overt methods. And when you limit yourself only to overt methods, then you're ruling out the study, certainly the naturalistic study of a large percentage of phenomena of interest when you're in the business of crime and justice and deviance.
Yeah.
So
Behaviors that we naturally try to hide from others.
I mean, I know, like during the Reagan era, that it was commonplace to say, to speak ill of no other Republican, and not trying to make a political comparison. But there are so few of us, I would not want to speak ill of any other qualitative criminologist.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say that, and I think in the introductory chapter in the Handbook of Qualitative Criminology, I opined on this to some extent, but that our definition and use of ethnography in criminology and criminal justice is very, very broad. Mm-hmm. It's very removed from original anthropological and early sociological fieldwork traditions. This idea of ethnography is going and spending extended periods of time in the field and interfacing with and coming to appreciate the customs and language and behaviors and daily interaction patterns and social dynamics of the subject group. That's rare and virtually non-existent in criminology and criminal justice. And if you're talking about doing so with live criminals, and you're talking about a level of risk to self that certainly would be irrational for most to subscribe to. But to the extent that we can selectively, in bounded ways, try to understand people in their setting, on their terms, I think that's going to be richer than if we try to come to them with our pre-manufactured approach, to which we then try to deductively confirm that, right? So the covert work, I just don't know that you're going to come up with any semi-structured interview questionnaire that you're going to administer to a sample of undercover drug enforcement agents, wherein they're going to articulate and you're going to appreciate how they, or if at all, they abuse informants. Right? Mm-hmm. So my dissertation work really wasn't covert. It was just a traditional interview study that was a snowball study of informants. But to this date, it's the only study that has an actual sample of informants. Mm-hmm. Everybody else, our knowledge base is what the police think about informants, mm-hmm. right? Well, I would say the original source is probably the preferable and original, basis of this topic, mm-hmm. per the namesake, right? Right. So, at the end of the day, the justification becomes that the means justify the end. Mm-hmm. Or I'm sorry, the end justifies the means, right? That we could otherwise not discover this information, right, in an overt manner. Okay. Yeah. So then the question becomes, in not disclosing your research role, is there any identifiable harm that I'm introducing into the conversation? So people have said, well, by being in the proximity of drug dealers and not telling them that you're a drug researcher and disclosing your purpose and so forth, if they were to get arrested later, how are you going to absolve yourself of a responsibility in that? And well, if I don't inform the police on them, they're at risk of that organically by the phenomena of what I'm studying. So, what I do know is the moment that I disclose that that's why I'm there, I'm going to invoke a Hawthorne effect and see, an alternative, version of what I hope to capture. Right.
Very interesting. So, kind of rounding third, so to speak, with the interview in the last couple minutes that we have, if it's okay, I'd like to sort of turn and reflect just more broadly, not so much on any one piece, but just the career as a whole. So, sort of what seems like maybe an easy question, but perhaps could it could be difficult to answer though, but are there things maybe that you would have done differently, or if you were to go back and start again, would the course of your career unfold differently, or would you wish that it had, or in some way taken a different turn?
That's probably a question that could be a whole other session.
Sure.
But I mean, the answer is of course. You know, early in my career, you know, I was just trying to get established and be successful, and readily agreed to participate in a lot of projects that really I didn't have a whole lot of interest in. That my participation in those projects was my first exposure to those topics. And in retrospect, you know, what I was really trying to do was Vita build. I think that for better or worse, I came out of graduate school during a time when not just the people out of Tennessee, but sort of the cohort of the years right before, during, and after getting the degree, there was sort of a frenetic interest with publication generation and counts, and I think we see as sort of an artifact of that the excessive sub-literature on ranking of everything today, which of course is largely count-driven, and I regrettably, I think, got caught up in that a lot, and while that led to a good amount of publication, you think that you have boundless energy and time early in your career, and now looking back, I mean, just from our conversation today, it's amazing that this has happened over 25 years when so much of it feels like it was just yesterday. So, in retrospect, I wish that I had passed on, some of these opportunities to really focus on that, which, I really believe is the most important.
That's really interesting. To hear someone who's had so much success, to say that they may have, could you do it differently, may have passed on some of those opportunities.
Well, I think it really comes down to how you define success.
Sure.
If you look at a lot of the leading figures in the field, they're most remembered for really only one or two, or most maybe three significant contributions.
That's true. Yeah.
So
your name can only be attached to a few things in people's memory.
As time grows shorter, you really think more so about the significance of what you're doing, and not just trying to do more as an end in of itself.
Would you say then, sort of leading you maybe a little bit here, but feel free to take it in a different direction, but would you say that perhaps that would be a key piece of advice you'd give to young scholars, that anyone who might be watching this, trying to look for some tips on what they should do?
Well, the best advice I could give to emerging scholars is to probably pass on a piece of advice that my dissertation advisor, who's now your colleague in Cincinnati, Michael Benson, gave me. So choose your research projects, frame your research agenda, not around that which you deem interesting, but what you can evidence is as being significant. Because what you find interesting, others may not. Right? But if you can make an empirical basis that this is important and has societal implications accordingly, then I think you're on a stronger platform of departure.
Very interesting. So, well then, maybe two more questions for you. The first one would be, what are some of the things, or what are a few of the things that you're most proud of?
Well, one of the things which we really haven't talked about very much today, because I've always seen the description of colleagues as, like a teacher or a scholar is a false dichotomy, because I really think that being an active scholar enables me to enliven the classroom and bring contemporaneous real-world examples of course material to light. So I sort of see this is a natural fusion of the two, and to the extent that we're providing evaluation work to improve the system, I see that type of research is also kind of a means of service as well. So I see the three realms of academic life very much intertwined. But within that, and thinking about teaching, I have tried to be a quality instructor over the years, and I've tried to care about the content of the discipline. As we've gone through the paradigmatic shift away from the criminal justice as professional school, and criminology is primarily sociologically based, and now this ongoing fusion of CCJ. And I really tried to both facilitate the CCJ emergence and the importance of, I guess, reflecting my background, the sociological contributions, which are at risk of being squeezed out from the practitioner side along the way, especially in what I tried to feature when I was JCJE editor through publication. But I think where that ends up really looking back is some of my students. Certainly there are too many to name all, but I look around today and I see some of my former students as some of the most cited and leading scholars in the field. You certainly would be among that group. I can't believe to see how much success that Wesley Jennings has had along the way. But I would certainly be remiss, not only because of her own success along with you and Wesley in terms of publication, productivity, and grants acquisition and other discipline accomplishments, but also because probably my staunchest supporter and most consistent colleague over the year, as well as life partner, would be Holly Miller. She has been most consequential, not only in what she's done to improve the work, but by being a readily available veto to help me stay away from becoming overcommitted and getting involved and not prioritize poorly, like I was referring to.
Her discretion is very good. Yeah.
So I am I'm very proud to see that these students I will say it makes me feel old to see my students being promoted now and moving even towards full professors, but I guess such is the progression of the career. I guess the other thing that I'm proud of would be where the work that we've done in offender programming, and we're already working in offender programming when the offender reentry movement broke, so we were well positioned, and then we were already in multiple agency settings doing reentry type work when that sort of intensified with the awareness, and we would like to think some of our publications helped to raise the awareness of the need for dual diagnosis and co-occurring attention, and now that has evolved into the justice mental health movement. But within all of this, it's kind of taken a new level of seriousness and severity with the opioids crisis, because the work that we do in framing these researcher-practitioner partnerships around the country are primarily in rural settings, and not that we chose, because it just so happened that the work that we were doing was already primarily in Ohio and other northern states where the opioids crisis is really severe. So we were sort of, I guess, postured there when it happened, but we tend to work with the county. If it goes well, then we get a good referral from a sheriff, and then work with an adjacent county and so forth. And we're trying to do as many of these as time and energy will allow. But in the early days, we were driven by the work, the extra earning potential that the grant work provided, as well as the conversion of all the final reports, the dissemination into research articles. And while those remain, focal concerns and certainly major, project tasks that we're engaged in, when I reflect on it, what we're doing is we're really introducing treatment services into impoverished rural settings where there otherwise would be none. So you have to we've had to come to understand the value and interpret it through almost a counterfactual logic, because there is, you can't be looking for things, because you get extra grant pay and you get publications, and so you are rewarded in these tangible ways, but intangibly, a brief anecdote: in the last 18 months, across 3 different settings, I have now interviewed 6 different offenders that have fatally overdosed. I originally started interviewing them while they were locked up in a jail or prison setting, and continued to interview them post-release in their outpatient treatment, usually for their weekly NA or other cognitive behavioral therapy session or whatever it may be. And I don't become personal friends with these people, but I come to know them, and you kind of come to root for them a little bit.
The human side
and
of
it's
it comes
just
through.
it puts a whole different sort of interpretation on what you're doing when you go back and they're not there anymore, and then you know why. I was fortunate to be asked to give the keynote address to the Ohio Jail Association last year, and I remember you were there. And I spoke on this topic of trying to expand offender treatment in Ohio, which is one of the epicenters of the opioid epidemics, where the fentanyl problem is just very much out of control. And it couldn't be more fitting or telling or appropriate to be there speaking on that topic at that time, because the headline in the newspaper, the local small-town newspaper that day, was at Tiffin University, that was the host university. But I guess the largest local town was Fostoria, Ohio, and it said Fostoria News, and the headline was "Local Fostoria Man Dies from Fatal Overdose." So, when I start to put a human face on this, it takes on a whole different reality, and we don't really hear about anyone that we saved. We only hear about the people that that passed away, but we certainly want to believe, and it certainly gives us more synergy going forward to do more, that without this programming and without these treatment services, there probably would be more of these fatal overdoses. So this allows us to start thinking about not translational criminology and what the discipline knows it, which is kind of an ivory tower, mostly pure researcher base that's sort of opining about the discipline, but more of an insider frontline account from the opiates crisis, the front line of the war on drugs and what's really going on.
Well, in our last few minutes, I'd like to hear, and I think maybe you'll kind of connect with that a little bit, but what would be your general thoughts on the direction the field is going, sort of the state of the field, and then the directions or the things that we should be thinking about as someone who hopes to be around in this field for the next 30 years myself, and you certainly have much more time in it, but what are things that we should be thinking about? What should we be doing?
Well, there's so much. There's so much going on with the various national criminal justice movements, if you will. The continuation of reentry and its progression into JMH, the many issues associated with criminal justice reform, the issues that are posed and will likely be more so in the future with immigration and crime. But thinking about this a little bit more narrowly to what I am involved in, I guess if I think about this in terms of maybe pure research or theoretical criminology, I think that we should and will move more towards an interdisciplinary orientation, and I think that this is going to be a natural byproduct of the continual emergence, the rise, if you will, of the CCJ paradigm, because most of the pure sociological criminologists, that is, those that remain in sociology, are reposturing their research agendas and outlooks around social justice themes that certainly overlap with, but are more often than not discrepant with the main, focal concerns of criminology and criminal justice. So as we move forward this way, I think there are going to be fewer people to object and want to keep things in terms of the traditional, pure, sociological theory. I don't think they'll ever go away, but I think that we'll move more towards theoretical integration. I think that would bode well, for certain camps, particularly the work you do in biosocial, where the sociologists have largely been obstructionists and impediments, and can move towards, in the same way that I see qualitative and quantitative methods complementary, we can see, how they're biological precursors of environmental influences, and how we have to have a more holistic understanding, of both if we're going to better define the very problems we purport to solve. So I see us kind of moving in that direction theoretically. In terms of the applied side, I hope we continue to move and stay along this line of mixed methods, which is inseparable from the evidence-based practice movement. I think that mixed methods are essential if we're going to validate these programs and participate in what was one of the measurable outcomes, which is getting programs credentialed to be entered into these national evidence-based registries, essentially menus from which practitioners can choose interventions that are best suited for them. Obviously the most prominent is crimesolutions.gov, but I have concerns, and I hope that especially my qualitative criminology colleagues will see that there is an unprecedented opportunity for applied field work and funding, and that in order to maximize this opportunity, not only those of us that are practicing qualitative criminologists today need to engage, but we need to start offering graduate coursework so where there is the capacity to do this moving forward.
Any last closing thoughts?
I think that's probably.
This has been a lot of fun, Mitch.
Thank you.
Always nice to talk.